Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this morning's session. It's entitled Mobile Learning for the Hard to Reach. And perhaps first I ought to introduce myself. I'm John Traxler, and I'm a professor of mobile learning. Apparently I'm the only professor of mobile learning. And I've devoted my last 10 years, I suppose, to attempting to explore the possibilities that we can use mobile devices, mobile phones in education. And I think one of our achievements has been to show that we can reach out to people and communities who were previously inaccessible to other educational interventions. And so the purpose of this morning's debate and discussion is actually to explore the nature of that possibility, to look at some of those interventions and see what they tell us about the future. And I think this is especially significant now because we're clearly moving into an era when these kinds of devices have become cheap, reliable, ubiquitous, and that opens up possibly much more sustainable models of using mobile technology to enhance and extend and support learning. And we've also actually, of course, seen the involvement of mobile technologies in all sorts of social and political change these last few years. We have a distinguished panel with us this morning. And I'd like to invite them on stage, and I'd like to introduce them. You can, of course, turn your mobile phones on. Okay, from left to right, we have Laurie Butgereit from South Africa, Tim Unwin from the United Kingdom, and Shabnan Agwal from India. And we're going to start by actually asking them to put the question, the topic, in the context of their own work. So I'll start,
John. Okay, thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit about the Dr. Math project that we're running in South Africa. And you know, on Monday in one of the sessions, people said that teenagers have good ideas also. It might have been in Mark Princely's session. And in South Africa, way before BlackBerry was there was a company called Mixit that did internet chat over cell phones for about the past 10 years. And South Africa has about 50 million people, and Mixit claims about 20 million users, most of them being teenagers. So we wanted to help with mathematics education. And it was the teenagers' idea that maybe we can help them on these devices using Mixit, the chat mechanism, again, similar to BlackBerry, but independent. And so what we started doing was like a homework helpline. Now, originally, we didn't think we'd get more than about 20 or 30 kids. If you think about it, this device is very personal. It's more personal than your toothbrush. I'll loan you my toothbrush before I loan you my cell phone, okay? So we didn't think teenagers would actually want to talk about mathematics, but we tried it. So we expected 20, 30, maybe 50 kids to take part. And we got 100, and then we got 500, and then we got 1,000. In fact, yesterday, we talked about scaling up. From that 20 or 30, we have about 30,000 children now, primary and secondary school pupils, who talk to us about their mathematics. Now, we run a volunteer model for the tutors. So we take volunteers from the local universities, and the volunteers sit at normal internet terminals, and they field these questions from the kids. So the kids start asking questions around 2 in the afternoon, and depending on the volunteers' schedules, we often operate until midnight, talking about mathematics up through high school trigonometry, some elementary calculus, all on 2.5 inches on your cell phone screen. And hopefully, we're going to be scaling up to even larger numbers in the next year or so. So watch this space.
Thank you, Laurie. Over to Tim next, please.
Thanks, John, and I'd just like to thank everyone who's put this session together. I think we're exploring some really challenging issues at the frontiers of where education might move, and Mixit's certainly a great example. Yeah, John asked us to say a little bit about ourselves, and in 5 minutes, it's interesting to think where we might begin. After Gordon's inspirational opening, I thought I would begin by sort of saying, well, you know, Socrates had sussed out most 21st century skills quite a long time ago. But you know, at a theoretical level, for the last 25 years, I think I've been very interested in the ways in which technology and power are related. I think those of us who believe in the use of new technologies to support some of the young, marginalized people in the world have to believe that technologies can serve the interests of the poorest and most marginalized communities with which we're working. Yet historically, technology has been used by those in power to remain in power. So at a theoretical level, that's something that has challenged me and interests me, and I just wonder the extent to which mobile devices can actually change that with respect to learning. And my views have changed, I think, from being very optimistic to being actually much more pessimistic now. I think at a practical level, we just went behind the scenes earlier to see how our names were going to be. And I was put down as emeritus professor, and I wanted that changed to emeritus learner, because I think in much of the discussions we've had so far, there's been far too much of a division between teachers and students. I hope I'm a youngish learner still here. But my research really over the last 10 to 15 years has been to do with how we can use ICTs to support the most marginalized people. And I care passionately about that. And if some of the things I'm going to say today actually seem to imply that I'm skeptical about the use of mobile learning, that's because it could do so much more than it's already done. Take country Y, that has 75% mobile connectivity. We tend to think that's marvelous. We tend to think that we can therefore roll out mobile learning to those people. Yet I view that as a disaster. 25% don't. And if we look at the latest fantastic publication by the ITU on the use of ICTs in developing countries, what it shows without any question of doubt is that the differences between access and use between the rich countries, the developing countries who are all on an upward curve, and the least developed countries who are all on the bottom are getting greater. So actually, technology is making it relatively more difficult for the most marginalized to have the benefits that most of us take for granted. And that's not just that they don't have, and this is not a cheap device, an iPhone is not a cheap device. You know, many poor people would only have a phone like this. And what you can do with this, yes, there are some things, but it's nothing like as cool as you can with this. So I want us to address the 25% who don't. I spent 3 months in China this year learning, and I'd like to pay tribute to one of the young learners here, Chen Fei, who was able to show me around and act as my research assistant. And I learned so much in that time. I learned so much about focusing on the needs of poor and marginalized communities. And as will come up probably in some of the discussions later, there are so many people who we tend to leave out. People with disabilities have so much more to gain from ICTs than those of us who have fewer disabilities. And yet, for a whole range of reasons, we're not really addressing them in the way that we should. How many speakers here have been people with disabilities, as is often defined? And the potential for mobile learning to support them in all sorts of different ways is enormous, and I would love us to be addressing that much more concretely. And that's something that the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization is very much going to be focusing on in the years ahead. But also learning, and in the discussion this morning, we focused a little bit around the difference in lifelong learning and formal learning. I don't actually get too hung up about that. I think schools are going to remain for a while because power structures want them to remain. But we all learn throughout our lives. And the diversity of learning needs of people in rural areas of China and likewise elsewhere in the world are enormous, but they're differentiated. We tend to want to provide blanket solutions, and we don't think enough about actually what the needs are. I'll leave it to your imagination what the needs of unemployed migrant workers in rural China are. And you know, we all talk about use of mobile learning for farmers. Hey, but farmers are generally quite rich. It's the landless laborers who are poor. So I guess, you know, my passion is about using ICTs and mobiles in particular to address the needs of the poorest and most marginalized. The market will take care of the majority. It is incumbent on states to deliver on the needs of all of their people so that we can actually make this world in which we live a fairer and better place. I'll leave it there, John. I could obviously rabbit on for much longer, but I hope we'll have a chance to engage with some of these ideas in our discussion.
Absolutely, thanks very much. And from Tim to Shabnan, please, speaking from India, about her experiences.
Thank you, John. Hi, my name is Shabnam Agarwal, and I, like Tim, have had an obsession with technology for the past 25 years, but that's been my whole life. And in the but in the past 5 or 6 years, I've had a particular obsession with mobile phones, which I'd like to talk a little bit more about. It started out in Germany, actually, where I was writing code for a new Nokia phone, and I was kind of interested in that, thinking that that would be really a fun experience, but actually I didn't feel like it was accessing the people that I cared most about, which was the poor. So I went out to Bangalore and I helped a microfinance organization speed up their loan process through the use of mobile phones. And that's actually where I came to realize that cell phones are the technology that are going to leapfrog all other technologies by accessing the poor first. Although TVs have done something similar, I think that cell phones have much more power and in a teeny tiny space as well. And so this is kind of where the obsession started. And it was soon after that that I became really fascinated with the educational implications of a cell phone when I was in Cambodia. So I'll tell you a little story. I was sitting with a friend of mine named Cham Nul, who had just recently been rescued from the sex trade in Cambodia, and we were having a really, really difficult time conversing. As you can imagine, she had really had very little education growing up, and we were just really having a struggle. And so, out of pure boredom, she decides to, pull out her cell phone, which, of course, is more like Tim's cell phone than my iPhone, and she starts typing and laughing hysterically. And I'm just sitting there thinking, great, okay, how do I engage this person? And so I look over at her cell phone and I see that she's got a joke on her cell phone through a text message written in Roman letters. And here I am trying to teach her the ABCs. So here I am thinking, okay, clearly I have missed out on something obvious, which is that she already knows the ABCs, but in a very different context. And it was kind of this aha moment where I thought, okay, well, here we are, there's something that can be done about this in a much smarter way. And there's a way to capitalize upon this that I think I wanted to work on. So I went off to India soon after that to experiment in making fun educational games on cell phones with an organization called Milli. And theoretically, what we were trying to do was both entertain, teach English, and access the poor all at once. The holy grail of education, as you might imagine. And it turns out, obviously, that this is much easier said than done. After a lot of struggle, I decided that we were coming at this in entirely the wrong way. We were focused entirely on children and not the teachers at all. So I decided to take a step back and go on something that I dubbed the Teach Tour, which is where I went to talk to various educators around the developing world and really find out what it meant to be an educator, for one, and not just an educator, but a parent and anyone who's working with children. And two, if there was anything that had succeeded in technology, in education and technology combined. And I, like Tim, have gone from being a very optimistic person in educational technologies to a critic, I would say. And so now my focus is more in teaching adults, as I said, and using technology in more of an assistive manner rather than the primary tool. So just briefly, what I do now is I work with Digital Green in New Delhi in India, and what we do is we make videos for and with farmers to teach each other about best agriculture practices in rural India. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all three of you for giving us all some context and a bit more meaning around what mobile learning might mean in terms of the hard to reach. I think we're already beginning to see that what seems a kind of simplistic and attractive notion that mobile technology will help reach people at the bottom of the pyramid, or indeed near to the bottom of the pyramid, we're beginning to see how that's rather more complex and rather more problematic than might have originally seemed, as each of the panelists have pointed out in their different ways. what we're planning to do now is actually to look at a set of questions that help to unpack that a bit more. And clearly the first and most obvious one is actually, who do we consider the hard to reach? And as I say, already the panelists have shown maybe slightly different definitions of that. So we'll go back to that question and actually ask them, put them on the spot about that particular issue of definition, starting with Laurie. Okay, who are the hard to reach?
Okay, well, in our case, the hard to reach originally were teenagers. We were wanting to help the secondary school people with their mathematics. And we wanted to help them after school. So in contrast to what you did, we sort of bypassed the teachers altogether. And the children or the teenagers talked about Dr. Math to their friends, and we grew from that 20 or 30 teenagers getting help with their mathematics to the 30,000 without actually involving the school system at all. So we originally thinking that it was the teenagers that were hard to reach, but as this word of mouth, this viral advertising happened for Dr. Math, more and more people who are perhaps more traditionally hard to reach came into the Dr. Math user group. So we would get kids that were at schools that didn't have math teachers. So in South Africa, math is required all the way up through grade 12. They have 2 streams, a technical stream that does, trig and beginning calculus, and they have a business stream, which is more financial. But many schools don't have math teachers. All right, so we would be helping those people. They would be considered hard to reach also. We would get kids that were in rural areas, kids that were on the taxis driving back and forth. So our definition of hard to reach has really changed. It started as teenagers and then became much broader as we got more and more users in.
Thank you. And Tim, you've already hinted at a slightly more complex definition as well.
Yeah, how long have I got now? I mean, I've got a whole range that I would add. I mean, I believe, as must be clear from what I said earlier, that those with disabilities are a huge group of people that we need to support. Why? Let me tell you a story. I was in an African country that will remain nameless, visiting a head of a special school for special education needs. And this was many years ago now. And he said, Tim, one of the biggest problems is when the children go home for the summer break. And naively, I thought, why? Surely they're with their family and home, and this should be a great time for them. They won't be away at the school. And it shows my naivety, because the head teacher said, well, when they go there, they're hidden away out of sight, sometimes in a corner of a hut. And we have to start again from scratch when they come back to school. Those with disabilities, friends and colleagues, so they may have just one disability, but otherwise they're as able as we are, and mobile devices can transform that so that they can participate fully in our societies. I think, secondly, those at risk of living and working on the streets. If you're a street kid, what do you want to use your mobile phone for most? Actually, probably learning when the police are going to raid you next. But huge numbers of people, and we've been working with people in some African countries to try and support that. The elderly, I'm becoming, many of you might think I'm already completely disabled, but I'm becoming much more so. Huge numbers of people. As we get older, we need assistive technologies. I can't read the messages that come on my device if I haven't got my glasses. Hey, there's a huge market there for somebody. Let me stop there, but say, I think those who are hard to reach are those who we do not even think of. They're beyond our imaginations. There are many, many people who are hard to reach. Let's actually dream of how we can use these incredible devices. They're so powerful. We don't use but a fraction of this power to support the lives of people who couldn't even dream about the place we're in. That is the challenge, and certainly that's the challenge that I want to lead my organization, the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization, into in the next 5 years.
Thank you, Tim. I think Tim makes some important points. I said that what I think we've established over the last 10 years is to at least demonstrate that in many, many different circumstances we can use mobile technologies to take learning to people or communities, or to some extent even to countries where it hasn't been before. And I ought to have said maybe that how we now define mobile learning has been in terms of its capacity to cross contexts. And that's to some extent what you're alluding to, our ability to use these technologies to cross the boundary between informal and formal learning, or between school and home, or between parent and child. But I don't think as a community, as a research community, we've fully thought through the implications of that in the context of disadvantage and of development. So I think we need to get back to that and think more clearly and more rigorously about how we can then use these technologies in the context of the developing world. I think also it's very easy, for example, for me, but also for corporations, to use the phrase and the idea that we can use these technologies to help people at the bottom of the pyramid. That's something of a misnomer. The people at the bottom of the pyramid are the ones that actually don't own phones, so we shouldn't get too relaxed about our achievements so far. There are still people who are unreachable through mobile phones because they have no access, no ownership, no familiarity, no confidence with them. Anyway, sorry, and the next contribution, looking at how we actually define the hard to reach.
Yeah, so I think initially, actually, for my definition, it was also very child-focused. It was children, at the base of the pyramid that we were talking about, and it's changed a little bit. I still believe that the children, especially in the most rural areas of the world, are obviously very hard to reach, especially considering that they are not the ones with the cell phones in their hands. Typically, it's the father of the family, if anyone. But now I actually am more interested in looking at the adults, because I think that the adults are the ones who will be teaching the children, and I think that they are even harder to reach because there's no central place for them to go to convene on a daily basis the way that children theoretically should have a place like a school. And so I think they're even harder to reach often than the children.
Okay, thanks very much. And again, we're jumping backwards and forwards to some extent, and we're already hinting at the answers to some of the succeeding questions. But the next question, okay, if it seems to be, at least at first sight, an attractive proposition, we can use mobile learning, mobile technologies with the hard to reach, then actually what, Tim, your turn next, but what are the barriers and the constraints actually in reaching them?
Yeah, and again, I will just highlight a few, but before I do that, can I just go back to the previous question? I mean, there's been the sort of thorn between two roses. I was quite sure that gender was going to be mentioned by my distinguished colleagues, and it wasn't. So I think, drawing on experiences of one of my PhD students who's been working in an Islamic country, the ways in which some traditional patriarchal societies limit the use of women in actually accessing and using mobile phones is a huge issue. But also in other parts of the world. Again, my recent work in China, the men all had the great new phones, and they then had a hand-down phone of their old one to their wives. The daughters didn't get a look in. And one of the pleas that the ladies had was, God, a great thing you could do is put up a very simple training scheme that each village chooses one woman who would be trained in how to use mobile phones properly for learning, and then she could spread that information around the community. Such an easy thing, but nobody's doing it. Okay, what are the constraints? I think, above all, it's our own imaginations. If everybody in this room actually now thinks, okay, who is it who most needs? We don't need to be accessing our emails all the time, all the day on a BlackBerry or an iPhone. Who is it who can really benefit from this technology, and what are we, each as individuals, doing about it? If we don't change what we do, having been at WISE, being here is a waste of our time and a waste of the money and effort that WISE and Auditoire are putting into this. So our own imaginations. I think secondly, if I just address disabilities, everyone tends to see people with disabilities as a tiny market, and therefore the products that are made for them, the research that's done on them, is really, really expensive. But let's go back to what I was saying about increasing numbers of elderly people, all of whom, or many of whom's eyesight is going. The RNIB in the UK is beginning to do some fantastic work on actually how we can use mobile devices to help people with visual impairments learn. But we've got to get the prices down. Companies are, of course, interested in serving the largest markets. So global capital is a constraint on how we reach the poorest. but there are many companies out there who are deeply committed actually to expanding their involvement. Those of us working in research in these areas, civil society organizations, need to help them to reach the unreached. Clearly, infrastructure makes a difference. There are actually many parts of the UK where it's very difficult to get broadband access. So I can't access the web, which is probably the biggest learning device, rather than apps necessarily developed by teachers. But quite simply, in many parts of the world, electricity, connectivity, the functionality of devices. One of the great things China achieved more than a decade ago, 95% of Chinese villages had electricity. Now, chatting with China Mobile, 99% of Chinese people have mobile access. I find those figures staggering. If only all the aid that we had given to Africa in the last 50 years had simply enabled 95% of the villages to have electricity, what a difference that would make. I better stop there. I could go on.
So now we move on.
Okay, so in our particular case, we have very few barriers for teenagers wanting to talk to Dr. Math. Luckily, we didn't actually have to write any cell phone software. Mixit did all that hard work, and they work on pretty much a WAP-enabled phone. As long as you've got WAP, it doesn't have to be a smartphone, with a little bit of Symbian there for you techies. They will have connectivity to Dr. Math. But our biggest barrier was getting the tutors on the other side. All right, so we're linking up people to people and the technologies in the middle. So we're not actually using the technology to deliver pre-made educational content. We're taking the kids and linking them up to the tutors. And it's a human to human, and the technology's just in the middle. So in the case of the Dr. Math project, the barrier, if we can say one exists, is that we have a shortage of tutors. And in fact, if there's any math professors out there, please talk to me after this debate. I can use some of your students. So in our case, it's a human barrier. It's not a technology barrier in the case of Dr. Math.
Finally, sorry, Shabnan, your view of the constraints and the barriers.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Tim and Lori both said. I think when it comes to the different things that you pointed out, Tim, like such as cost, infrastructure, web access, electricity, it comes down to kind of a hardware versus software issue, I think, which is, if we look at one laptop per child, for example, in my opinion, a total failure, and no offense to anyone who's worked on it, but I think the biggest issue was that it was a hardware, right? I mean, the software was also flawed, in my opinion, but the hardware was a new hardware that we're dropping into the hands of children. One, electricity obviously was an issue, the infrastructure and the cost. I mean, although it was free, I think, there were free, to end user, right? And I think at the end of the day, also, it was a human capital issue, just like Lori said, right? The teachers were not well trained in order to use the laptop that they were given or to fix it. And so I'd love to talk about actually one audience member who might be here is Hilmi, and he works with a company he started ZMQ. And ZMQ is really interesting because it's a software that's developing, it's a company that's developing educational games for a very low cost. He charges maybe 2 to 5 rupees per game, and he teaches people about AIDS and HIV issues. And I think it's just really fascinating what he's done to overcome these barriers that you guys have mentioned. So agree with them, and just wanted to give some examples of failures and successes.
Okay, so thanks. So what we have is a quite kind of fractured and not a comprehensive account of the barriers and constraints. There isn't something that needs a magic or silver bullet. It's actually quite a complicated and maybe kind of partial picture. That makes it quite challenging. We then thought we ought to go on and address, maybe it's a fundamental question about why should mobile devices provide learning solutions? What's so good about mobile learning? And I think actually the mobile learning research community, I suppose, in some senses has been attempted to answer that question for the last 10 years, but in a rather maybe incomplete, possibly narrow kind of way. I mean, I suppose what we've established with myriad small-scale projects run with a subsidy is that we can deliver learning. It'll raise students' motivation, especially disenfranchised, disengaged learners. But we haven't actually addressed the wider questions about why mobile devices as opposed to more school libraries? So it's been a kind of inward-looking agenda, maybe, and we haven't addressed the question, okay, if it's so good, can we do it without a subsidy? Can we provide a business model or a sustainable model? So maybe we can look at those issues, but also, yeah, why mobile learning? Why so good? Why so appropriate?
So I think for me, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that mobile devices, as Tim has rightly pointed out, are no longer hard to reach, even for the hard to reach, theoretically. I'm going to throw out some little factoids for fun. I'm a nerd and I love factoids. So there's 7 billion people in the world, surprise, surprise, and 1.7 billion of those are in absolute poverty. And what that's considered by the World Bank is they don't have basic human needs: clean water, nutrition, healthcare, education, clothing, shelter, etc. 2.5 billion are in relative poverty, which is a little bit vague, but basically it says that they all have a lot less than what we have. And surprisingly, 5.3 billion mobile subscribers in our world today. 5.3 billion. That means that 1 out of every 3 people have their own mobile phone, and the rest at least know who to bribe to get access to a mobile phone. So that's 77% of the population, which I think is pretty incredible. And what that's telling us is that mobile phones are becoming ubiquitous, which I guess a lot of you already knew. And I heard a really interesting fact yesterday by one of the speakers named Francois Tadei, and he said that mobile phones are more powerful. Mobile devices are more powerful than the technology it took to get us to NASA, for NASA to get us to the moon, which I did look up and verify. And so what does this mean? This means that this tiny little device, or maybe even Tim's tiny little old school device, has the capability to get me to the moon, but can it build me a rocket ship and put some fire under my ass to get me there? And I argue that it alone cannot. What I argue is that the foundation necessary to use technology as a learning tool can only be set by human beings.
Thank you, Laurie.
Okay, well, I'd like to actually just build on that. One of the interesting things we find with the tutors is that they often inspire the people, their tutees, the teenagers that they're talking to. So although our tutors sign codes of conduct that they're only supposed to talk about mathematics, we let them talk about other things about education. So they can complain about their teacher, and they can complain about that they've got an exam coming up. But they often wonder why they should stay in school. And this is talking about getting the fire under you. So we have this human to human using technology in the middle, and they're inspiring them. They're looking up for the kids. What are the requirements to go to university? What mark do they have to get on this exit exam in order to qualify to go to university? So why do we use mobile? I can only speak for South Africa. It's the only way we're going to reach the teenagers and the children, because they all have mobile phones. South Africa, most of the cell phone providers offer a 2-year contract. If you want to get a high-end phone, I can go get a 2-year contract. At the end of the 2 years, I keep my phone, and there's a very high giveaway rate. There's projects that refurbish the phones and give them away. There's a big secondhand market, and just about every teenager has a phone. In fact, for those of you who might know South Africa, there was research done in the Cape Flats area, very poor area, where they interviewed the children, the teenagers, and said, do you have access to a phone? And 97% of the teenagers said they had phones in some of the lowest township, poverty-stricken township areas. So everybody has a phone. So I like this idea of putting fire under them. So not only can we help them with their mathematics, but we can inspire them to pass mathematics and try to get into university. Thank you, Laurie. That leaves Tim?
One of the troubles coming third is that you have to rewrite everything you're going to say. But let's not forget some basic, simple things. These devices are small, they're light, anywhere, anytime, more or less, provided you're in reach of your nearby tower. They're multifunctional. So all those things, fantastic, definitely help deliver. A couple of things I just want to pick up on. One is this point about being relatively cheap. One of the things that staggers me is just how much poor people spend on their mobile devices. I've got a colleague working a Finnish colleague working in Tanzania. And he recognizes that some field work he's been doing, and these figures are, most people don't believe them, but he's a great researcher, so I do. But poor people are spending something like 30% of their income of any kind on mobile connectivity. That raises huge questions to me. What were they spending that money on beforehand? The value they place on communication, and actually getting some really good cost benefit of what they're saving and what they're spending. Certainly, again, with some of the rural farmers I was working with in China, one of them I remember distinctly saying, I couldn't do my job if I didn't have my mobile phone. I need to learn from that about markets, about products, inputs, outputs, and he said he would be out of business if he didn't have it. So these are definitely life-changing devices. I think something my colleagues haven't mentioned that I'd like to draw attention to is, and I guess it comes a little bit from my interest in working with people with disabilities, is voice, text, image, sense. These devices actually can incorporate all of our senses, and we need to do much more work, although there is some fantastic work going on about voice to text and text to voice, how we interpret images. So how can a person who is blind interpret an image on the mobile phone? And you can imagine that we could actually have some tactile elements to this, that could be developed into it. So I think that touches on something that is at the heart, and I would like to see changing. Far too much use of ICTs generally, but mobile devices in particular, to me, seems to be primarily on content. It's ways of accessing content. These devices are so much more than just that. They are primarily communication devices. And actually involving communication, be it through text, be it through voice, networks of learners supporting each other, is to me very exciting. And I would just like us to shift much more to using the communicative potential of mobile devices rather than just them as an opportunity to download or send content.
Yeah, and I think I'd underline Tim's point about the emphasis, the overemphasis maybe on content. I think it misses out the possibility of creating networks of learners able to discuss and generate learning rather than just to consume it. And I think that brings us on, certainly in my mind, to a further point that actually I'm not sure how much work we've done about the ways different communities learn, what it means within any particular community to know, to come to know something, what it is worth knowing, how you know it, who you know it from, and how you demonstrate you know it. And I think there's a risk, because these technologies scale up so obviously easily and have vast economies of scale, to assume that therefore that's the opportunity to broadcast content irrespective of its value or worth within any particular community. And maybe Laurie would say something about that in the context of young South Africans, and Tim might say something completely different about that in the context of Chinese farmers. But the point would be that these communities will all have different perspectives about what is worth learning and how you learn it. And I think the viewpoint that these technologies can transmit content very, very easily, as I say, risks neglecting other possibilities about what the nature of learning actually is. So I'm glad Tim brought that up. Okay, and we have one last question before we move on to your points of view and your questions in the audience, and that was, where do you see the barriers preventing us reaching the hard to reach and accessing the kind of benefits that we may or may not be describing? And Laurie was going to take that first.
Well, I can only speak in the case of Dr. Math in South Africa. And in our particular case, it's the shortage of those tutors, those university students on the other side that are answering those kids' questions. So, like I said before, we're not actually delivering content. It's a teenager primarily driven conversation. He logs in and says, I need help solving parabolas, or I need help with sine and cosine, and the tutor responds. So in our specific case, and it's very specific, it's that expertise, the person who wants to volunteer their time on the other side. And although I've been saying that they're South African university students, and 95% of them are, we have a sort of growing population. We have a handful of tutors in the middle of the United States, of all places, in Ohio, math teachers who log in and help kids in South Africa. We have a couple South Africans in Switzerland who want to give back to South Africa, and some growing professionals in the science, although in the science industry who also volunteer. Okay, but in our particular case, we need that expertise. Just like you said, it's people-to-people communication. It's not just content delivery.
Thank you.
Sorry, I got out of order there. In more ways than one, probably. Okay, I think it's those of us in the education business. We need to escape our school classrooms, our university lecture halls, our libraries, and actually get out there and focus what we're doing much more on the needs of the poorest and most marginalized. So actually, all these people contributing to your work is fantastic. And I think one of the challenges, all too often, mobiles are seen, and it's often said, as a silver bullet to fight against poverty. Just think about that language. Surely learning is about peace, not about war. Surely we should be talking, if you like, about a warm silver hug, which is a communal activity. And I just use that as a kind of example of what I mean about changing the ways in which we think about these things. We need to be driven by the needs of learners, whoever they are. I particularly love working with my PhD students. I see them, in a sense, as my masters. I'm there to support them because they're the people who are going to make the huge differences in the world ahead. But likewise, we need to be out there supporting the learning needs of farmers, the learning needs of all the communities we've spoken about. I think, secondly, I would just go back to something I said a little bit earlier, and this question in some ways closely parallels the second question, and that is the rising tide of privatization in education. Okay, the market will take care of the needs of the majority. I've said that before. But states fundamentally still have responsibility for all of their peoples. And so we need to work together with states to enable them to support delivery of learning through mobile technologies in the poorer, more distant communities. And actually that's why I think the role of the regulators is so important. I haven't heard many conversations about universal access or universal service funds. But one of the things we're doing in the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization is trying to work with the regulators, with the funds, to enable governments to roll out some of these technological solutions to the people who the market will not address. And I still think we need really good value for money devices. Yeah, smartphone prices, of course, are coming down. But let's try and devise devices that will really, really enable learning. I'm doing a survey together with my Chinese colleagues on mobile learning generally, and if there are any learners here, love you to take part in it. But some of the early, it's across the world, and some of the early figures are maybe surprising to those of you who believe passionately in mobile learning. Something like only 10% of students, and this is amongst university students, actually reckon they use their mobile device regularly for any kind of learning. 90% say that the screen size is too small. This is too small. Some of the tablets are too big. Free piece of advice, it's going to be a device a little bit bigger than this that you can still carry around with you, not as big as an iPad or whatever. But let's get that cracked so we can design devices that are really going to enable learning in its richness to take place.
Semi. Yeah, so I definitely agree with a lot of what you both have mentioned. With regards to value for money devices, I think I would also argue that value for money as far as not just devices and the hardware again, but the idea of connectivity to 3G, I think, and just having access to the internet will be so powerful. I mean, with Millie even, we had such a hard time because we were creating apps, which is all fine and dandy, but how do you get them? Well, you have to go to an internet cafe or you have to get some sort of SIM card that can connect you to the internet. And that's a big barrier to entry. So we, now after that, I started looking at text messaging the way Lori does, because text messaging at the moment is the lowest common denominator, and it's a very limiting lowest common denominator. So I think that's huge. And I think also, as far as content goes, I think that there's a lot going on now as far as bringing content to the devices, right? We can't just put a mobile phone in the hands of everyone. We need to have the content that's on there to allow them to learn. And I think that'll be huge as well. And lastly, with the policy situation, I think, with Digital Green, for example, the government of India has been hugely, hugely supportive of Digital Green and trying to figure out how they can partner with us to use the mobile phones. I think, China and India have the biggest mobile phone subscribers in the world today. So I think that the governments are coming around, but slowly, I agree, very slowly, and in kind of a funny way, but well, let's see.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to just add something coming from a different direction, and that's work we've been doing in the UK higher education sector in looking at the notion of digital literacy. And that, if you like, is the concept of being able to create, express yourself, comprehend a digital world. And clearly, a subset of that increasingly is going to be, if you like, mobile digital literacy. How do we express ourselves and comprehend the digital and mobile world around us? And for the university sector in the UK, one of those consequences is that the challenge to the role of teachers or of lecturers or professors, that maybe owing to generational differences, we are going to have to persuade them of the virtues of actually learning from their students in the way maybe Tim was talking about. So a shift from the teacher being the authoritative source of information, knowledge, theory, to one where the teacher is having to learn alongside, to learn from their students. And that's quite challenging, and people have talked about the difficulty of changing at a kind of systemic and professional level in other parts of the conference. And it reminds me of another, if you like, barrier to the adoption of mobile learning, and that's clearly affording it. We'll only manage to afford mobile learning if we can, if you like, exploit the fact that people, kids, adults, everyone own phones. So there's a disjunction, if you like, between e-learning and m-learning, where in e-learning or CAL, the institutions, the schools, the colleges, the universities provided the equipment and basically defined the rules of the game. They said to students, this is the basis on which you can use the technology for learning. We're moving from that state of affairs to a state of affairs where we have to say, well, if we're going to use mobiles, it's going to have to be the learners, the students, own mobiles. And both in the school sector and the university sector, in conversations in South Africa and in the UK, that's quite challenging or intimidating for teachers. All of a sudden, the locus of control, if you like, who controls what's going on within the classroom, has moved. The agency, who's driving the learning process, is a lot less likely to be centered at the front on the teacher and centered somewhere amongst the learners. So I think that's one barrier no one else had mentioned, but I think it's probably implicit in a lot of what was being said. I suppose I'd also like to commend Lori's work, actually, because one of the holy grails of the mobile learning community has been to find sustainability. And as I say, that's, I think, mostly going to be based around exploiting learners' own phones, but it also involves other players having an interest. And so Lori has got this magic combination of the teachers or the mentors contributing on a sustainable basis as well, and there being, I guess, some profit margin for the network as well. So everyone is getting something out of it. Okay, so now we're at that stage in the proceedings where we're actually going to open it up and ask for contributions, questions, discussion from everyone in the audience. And perhaps you'd like to probe a bit further some of the bigger issues behind the questions and the answers and the discussion so far. I mean, clearly one of them has been scale and sustainability. We haven't actually talked about the nature of the learning that we think we maybe ought to be delivering to the hard to reach. And the potential or the opportunity or even the need, the desirability of using mobile learning to attract learners into formal learning and formal institutions. So, let me see. Are there already some questions? I can see someone over there beside the number 2, so please go ahead. Maybe if you could say who you are, if you've got someone in particular you'd like to address the question to.
Okay, my name's Donald Clark. I've been involved in several mobile learning projects. When I received my new iPhone, it had Siri, the voice recognition thing, and I asked it the meaning of life, like everybody does, and it came back with the answer chocolate. And however, I then, as a maths teacher, started asking it maths questions, and it was absolutely gobsmacking how good this was. I just wonder if the panel, specifically on Dr. Maths, sees this voice recognition with artificial intelligence as a real answer to replacing the warm body, non-scalable tutor teacher. I have been knocked sideways by Siri and see it as a massive boost to mobile learning in that sense.
Okay, I can only speak from the work that we've already done. And in our particular case, it's that human-to-human communication that sells Dr. Math. Those kids, those teenagers, they want to speak to a human on the other side. There's actually lots of initiatives in South Africa that have phones to digital content, especially on mathematics. There was a project with Nokia where they gave them some curriculum-based stuff over their cell phone, also through Mixit. There's lots of facilities where they can look up things in Wikipedia, but in our particular case, it's the human-to-human touch, okay? It's that there's a tutor on the other side that's actually going to help them step by step to factor that polynomial, okay? And so the other problem in South Africa, of course, is the cost of those phones. In the case of Dr. Math, we're running it on low-end WAP phones. You know, the cost of phones vary from country to country, but we're talking about a phone that costs about $100 for the entry-level one where they can access Dr. Math. So maybe what you're proposing is an ideal situation where everyone can have a smartphone, but it's not where we're at right now in South Africa.
Do you want to add anything? No?
Yeah, I do. I agree. As I've been talking about, I also believe, as I said, that the cell phone cannot create the rocket ship or put the fire. So the human beings are hugely imperative. However, I've been talking to at least 10 different people over the course of the last 2 days about Siri, and I think that there are huge, huge implications with Siri. I definitely agree, and I think that what it implies for the potential for people to now learn a language, for example, just purely by asking the questions it wants to ask, or the person wants to ask, right? I mean, no longer do you have to rely on what Rosetta Stone decides you should learn, like where's the bathroom, but no, now I can ask you, you know, what's your favorite bird or something. So, you know, I think I agree. I think that it has huge implications. I think there's a lot still to be done with Siri, and I think I would love to see where it goes in the next year or two with what people can do with it, like math teachers and other types of developers, definitely.
The question you didn't ask was the one about, okay, if phones can do all of this for you, then actually, why are we learning it? I mean, it's kind of the calculator question. You know, if calculators can do long multiplication, why do we need to learn long multiplication? So I don't think we've fully thought through the extent to which mobile phones, mobile technologies, clearly the smarter ones, change the nature of what we know and what we need to know and what they can do for us instead of us having to do for ourselves. So I think that's quite a fluid kind of area. You know, these are providing, if you like, assistance and support for teaching, but they're also changing the nature of learning. Okay, sorry, did you want to come back?
Can I just add one more thing? Some of our tutors also voluntarily said that they would prefer to tutor in Afrikaans and Setswana. Okay, and although they're doing it text by text, that would also be a different barrier that would happen if we tried to go voice.
Yeah. Okay, I can see a question near the back, number 4. Please.
Yes, hi, good morning. Mark Behrens, University of Notre Dame, USA. Picks up on the last question somewhat, but going back to the quip that Gordon Brown had in his speech about how politicians are not always good communicators, but they haven't lost the gift of speech. And so what I wonder with kind of transferring that to mobile devices, there's a lot of speech there, but what do your organizations do to ensure effective communication so that your innovation's goals are actually attained in terms of the hard to reach? And maybe you could comment on the research side of that as well.
Thank you for that, Mark. I think that's really imperative to keep in mind. And what we do, at least in the organization I'm with right now, which is Digital Green, is we realize that one-to-one, which would be similar to Siri, which would be me looking at the cell phone and learning something, was way, way less effective than having a group of 15 farmers in a room learning and watching a video together and then communicating with one another and having discussion afterwards. So that's kind of how, at least at Digital Green, we try to encourage communication amongst one another, a really deep discussion about the topic that they've learned and kind of figuring out whether or not they're going to adopt the practices that they've learned on the videos. So that's kind of how we battle this idea that one laptop per child or one phone per child is accurate, but rather the classroom learning and this ability to have a community is very important in communication.
Anyone else?
I think we should hear more questions from the floor and less from us. So that's why I'm
Okay, so there
dipping
is
out.
a woman in white, number 5, over there. Let's hear from her.
Hello, my name is Sheree McFarlane. I'm studying in Stellenbosch, South Africa. And I would like to know from Mrs. Butkerite, I think maybe it's a bit long time back for you, but as students we often have quite large financial challenges, and I've experienced that as a student in South Africa. I had to scale down so much on using internet on my cell phone because it's so expensive. And for me, talking about how mobile phones can bring education to the difficult to reach would also implicate that bringing it to people less fortunate and in low socioeconomic status, with low economic status. Don't you find this as a big challenge, and how do you address that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the important things is that we are sticking with text. We are not, from a technical point of view, for you techies out there, we're not transmitting voice. We're not transmitting images. We are trying to keep the transmission as small as possible. And you know, our tutors are talking to 20 and 30 kids at the same time. They don't have time to be verbose and send big packets of information. And the kids are also, you know, they're typing on a little keyboard. However, a number of the carriers, if I'm not mistaken, Cell C has zero-rated communication with Mixit, and currently I think Vodacom is in some discussions on that. But remember, we're talking about 2 rand a megabyte. Okay, I don't know what that is, about 20 US cents a megabyte. And a child is not going to type in a megabyte talking to Dr. Math. I wish they would, okay, but they aren't.
Yeah, I'll just quickly, I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, I was in Australia recently, and my broadband connectivity ran out after almost no time at all, and was so I couldn't phone home. But also I couldn't Skype home, actually, if that's I got really told off. So I sympathise with you. I mean, I think one answer is the trying to generate low-cost solutions. What I'm particularly interested in is that there's far too much talk about free. Yeah, it may be free to end user, but it's actually often incredibly expensive to develop solutions. So one wants to have, you know, total cost models and actually drive that price down so that we can enable educational solutions for learners to be at real value for money. And the way I look at it is, yeah, people will pay for things they find useful. So actually, maybe a lot of the stuff we're generating, they don't really find useful. We need to begin to think about these things in different ways. And I go back to what I was talking about the regulators and why governments are so important. You know, in delivering educational solutions for some of the poorest communities who can't afford it. And yeah, you're right. I mean, my son, you know, I got him an iPhone for his birthday present, and when it broke and he couldn't get it replaced for free, he had to downgrade. So, you know, this isn't just in some of the poorer parts of the world. You know, I use this when I travel because it's cheaper.
If I can just add one more thing. Many of the pupils who talk with our tutors might say, why don't you look this up? and they say the images cost too much, so that the tutor would look them up, scrape out the images, and then send just the text to the child.
And in the UK, we have an agreement with the network operators such that the entire university sector buys text messages in bulk, and they can then be passed down to the individual universities. So, I mean, I guess that's reducing the cost. A different scheme, you know, and that would be viable for any sector within a country. And something else that's happening is that large local authorities using mobile learning strategies are paying for data on kids' phones, and the kids themselves are meeting the bill for voice and message. So I think it's not just a relationship between the supplier and the individual kind of retail consumer, but there are other players we could work with. Okay, can I take a question from somewhere over there, number 1 maybe? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Salma Musa. I'm a senior here at Georgetown University. My question is for the whole panel. Ms. Agarwal, you mentioned that one of the reasons why mobile phones are so effective is that they're so pervasive, especially even in relation to TV. But one of the reasons why TV is so penetrative, especially in the developing world, is that because of the high illiteracy rates. So when you were all talking about the constraints, you mentioned lack of infrastructure, funds, lack of tutors, but no one mentioned illiteracy. So especially when we're talking about people who are near the bottom of this pyramid that we're talking about, how important is literacy to mobile literacy, especially when it depends so much on, as a mode of communication, it depends a lot on text messaging. Thank you.
Sure, that's a great point, Selma. Thank you for bringing that up. And yes, TV obviously is much more pervasive, especially for the illiterate. I think one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that there's voice abilities on a cell phone. So with the the advent of IVR and kind of voice recognition, as the other man rightly pointed out, there's quite a bit that can actually be done over the cell phone for illiterate people. So at Digital Green, for example, most of our farmers happen to be illiterate because they're in the rural parts of India, and we've experimented with having the farmers have this database where they can call in and ask questions, and someone is on the other side, similar to what Lori's doing, but voice-based. And then someone's on the other side, they respond to the question through voice, and then the person gets a phone call with the kind of voicemail of sorts. So that's kind of how we address it. I definitely think with TV, first of all, you have images, which is why Digital Green also uses images, which is really powerful. And right now, cell phones, at least for the rural poor, don't have really the ability to do video and image.
Well, in our particular case, we didn't address that problem. We were going after secondary school kids, although you might not think they're literate looking at the quality of the questions, okay, but they are literate. Oddly enough, though, we are getting younger and younger children asking questions with Dr. Math. We've got some as young as grade 2. And so that's sort of beginning literacy, I guess, but we didn't tackle the general illiteracy problem.
I think you raised an important issue, again, that we haven't touched on really, and that's for any given country, region, group of students. We actually need, when you mention television, we actually need not to assume that mobile learning or using mobiles to deliver learning is going to be a delivery mechanism, if you like, that's dominated by mobiles. We just need to find a place for it within the rest of the ecology. So in some countries, we need to look at how it might complement radio, or print, or TV in your case. So again, I'm drawing back from any kind of large-scale prescriptions, but I think your mention of TV is good. How can we work with TV? If TV is a dominant mechanism, how can we work with radio? If that's the dominant mechanism, what's the kind of complementarity we can work on? Okay, there's a question number 4, gent in a pale jacket, I think. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Aya, and I'm also a student at Georgetown. And my question was regarding when you were talking about populations that have the most access to mobile phones. And you mentioned China as being one of them. But at the same time, we also know that China has heavily censorship. So what's the relationship between, although you have the access to mobile phones and mobile learning, do things such as censorship or education from the government impose a restriction on that? Thank you.
Yeah, let me broaden that out rather than one specific question and go back actually to the very first thing I said, which is the relationships of power and technology. I used to, and part of me I think still has to believe, that these technologies are very anarchic. bit like the web. They do have the power to change power relationships. And I think those of us working in the field of ICT for development have to believe that, because people are poor because that's the way our societies are. That's the way powerful people in our societies want to keep them. There are advantages in having poor people, however horrible that might seem. Now, if we really wanted to eliminate poverty, we could do so. And that's not just about economic growth. It's actually about development in a much, much wider sense. So one of the really, really interesting things about technologies, and particularly mobile devices, is the way that both they can enable people to use them in a very bottom-up way, but at the same time, actually, the powerful can use that to control and understand what the people are doing. Many societies monitor all digital traffic. And there's some fantastic research being done on freedom on the net, for example. Now, some of the interesting things are actually the technology changes far more rapidly than the legal system can change. So I think technology is often one step ahead of the game. But the actual control I come from a society which has the most video surveillance, CCTV, of any society in the world. And I find that deeply scary. And one of the exercises I give my students is to try and go from A to B. You measure the distance from A to B in a straight line, and then measure what the distance is without being seen on CCTV. And I did that last year, and they all came back and said, I actually can't do it. Now, I'm using CCTV as an example, but it's exactly the same with mobiles. It's probably a bit of a platitudinous answer, but I think the human spirit always finds ways of achieving what it wants to do. And let us just hope that the right balance is achieved between the very definite needs for control, and that's what the contract that citizens make with the state, social contract theory, etc., and the needs for freedom. And it is very, very difficult. I think far too many simple answers have been given, particularly over the last year, about the ways in which digital technologies have moved towards transforming societies. We're on a long walk. There are going to be many changes. And my fear, going back to what we were saying earlier, is how optimistic we are or pessimistic. I used to be really optimistic. I have to say I'm now much more on the side that actually these are ways through which we're controlled. Those who must know the Apple devices, you could actually map all where you'd used your phone. And companies have that information as well. The amount of research that the mobile operators have on actually how you use your mobile phone, where you use it, where you are, what you're doing with it, is huge. And they use that to increase their profits. So we should be concerned about that as much as we should be concerned about the ways in which states seek to control people.
Can I just say also, I think to that last point that, Facebook in a similar way can tell you way more than you know about yourself. But we do use it to our benefit, I think, also. And so there's a lot of times where we capitalize upon the fact that Facebook knows more about me than I know about myself. And I think so there's often times where this kind of minute knowledge about a human being can be helpful and then also hurtful.
Google should pay us for every time we use Google, because that's how they make their money.
Okay, I'd like to move on to a couple of questions from the Twitter stream. One I will definitely save until the last, because it's that kind of horizon gazing kind of question. But there's one about what are the pedagogic issues to consider in mobile learning initiatives? So who wants to?
I will start, and I'll tell you the truth. I'm not a teacher. I'm not an educator. Okay, I'm a mathematician and a techie. So in our particular case, we're letting the teenagers drive the conversation. Okay, and I have no idea what that is called in education. The kids ask the questions and we help them, and that's what we're doing.
Teacher, you go. Okay, I'm a learner. No, which is my answer, of course. That I think one of them is fundamentally, and John, you've touched on, is the balance between learners and teachers. And I think these devices and the technologies help us fragment that. And I think that's exciting and it's innovative and it creates new things. I think secondly, and I've touched on it a little bit before, the balance between content and communication. And one of the real things that frightens me is the way in which so much use of digital technologies in learning have emphasized content. It's not just mobile, but and downloading content and people just learning that content and regurgitating it. That is not what education is to me, and many people have raised that already. It's about developing learning communities. It's communicating between teachers and learners, between learners and each other. It's about building networks. It's about thinking in new ways. It's about being creative. And these technologies can do that, but it just saddens me that all too often that they just become a kind of content depository. You might as well have a little chip, you know, we'll all go around and just download it. That isn't what learning's about.
That's okay.
Okay, so we have only a couple of minutes left, and I've received what is clearly the question to finish on, and that's actually what do the panel see as the agenda for the next 5 years. I think that whoever asked the question has been very conscious. We've been talking about constraints, challenges, slip-ups, so I'd actually like to hear the upbeat side of it. What's the agenda for the next 5 years?
Well, I'll start because I'm on a very specific project and we have a very specific agenda. So when we started, you know, in our wildest dreams, we thought we might get 50 kids, and then we said, oh, maybe we can get 500, and then we thought about 5,000, and then we've got 30,000, and my boss said we're gearing up to 1 million kids in the next 2 years, so that's our agenda.
Great. So 5-year agenda. This is a little bit daunting, but also exciting for me to talk about. I think, for one, Siri, as was pointed out, I think has huge implications, and I think the 5 years coming up, for one, there's going to be 3G, hopefully in a lot more accessible way. Also, smartphones will begin to trickle down, I think, and allow for the ability, much more capabilities on the cell phones. In a very specific education sense, I was looking at starting something called Hobnob, which is where students actually can text message their teachers in an anonymous fashion about how interested or engaged they are in class. So right now, imagine you guys are all sitting in class. You would text me right now that your engagement level is quite low because I see some people sleeping. But, you know, and so I think that the future of education with regard to mobile phones, I think, will involve a lot more of the students defining the pedagogy for themselves and defining their own curriculum for themselves and accessing that curriculum, whatever is their passion, on the cell phone or even on a computer or on some sort of mobile device. So that's what I see.
This is a highly apposite question for me personally because as I've recently taken over as CEO of the CTO, we're developing a new strategy exactly on this, but that's more broader than just education. But I think just some directions of where our strategy is going, which I think does answer the question. As I said earlier, it's focusing on, let's say, the 25% who don't have connectivity, and when we've done that, it's on the 5% who don't, and when we've done that, it's on the 1%, so that everybody has access to the potential of what the rest of us have. I think, secondly, it is trying to develop solutions for the most marginalized, and I've emphasized throughout people with disabilities, and how we can actually develop learning solutions for them. And I think, above all, it should be that we should be listening to the needs of learners and developing solutions. One size isn't going to fit all. That's been emphasized in our session and elsewhere. It's developing appropriate solutions for the learning needs of all of those who are hard to reach. And let's not forget that the hard to reach is our definition, and we need to change our imaginations to achieve that. Okay,
that's the last question. That's critical but upbeat, I hope. I'd like to thank you all for attending, and I'd like to thank the panel for contributing their input, their perspectives, and their experience, and hope it's been worthwhile, and hope you enjoy lunch. Thank you very much.